Beginning in the decades leading up to the 21st century and continuing into modern day at an exponential rate is an increased flow of labor across international boundaries, which consequently parallels observable increases in international flows of trade and financial capital. The causes for this immense human migration are changing the nature of the geographical flow of human beings at a rate faster than ever before in human history. In order to promote the tolerance of beliefs and values, including religious traditions through mindful leadership that stress common ground and complementary resources, those public or private institutions which can create robust and holistic methods of both understanding and employing a diversity of values will gain the competitive and proactive advantage of a more globally diverse array of perspectives in generating new ideas to solve global challenges. Which brings us to what I consider to be one of the lost, yet essential elements within our current dilemma. If we are going to effect real cultural change, we must address both our individual consciousness and our culturally collective consciousness. We must address how we see the world and how we make meaning. In order to begin to shift our consciousness and effect real cultural change, some questions we must begin to ask ourselves are: what steps can I take to begin to incorporate others within my culture and life? What can we do to begin to elevate our personal and collective consciousness? What limiting habits of mind must I release? One area that we can begin to focus on and change is developing pedagogies and curriculum that elevates our consciousness. We can begin to more fully integrate mindfulness into our everyday practices, including how we educate our youth. Where mindfulness is awareness that is cultivated by paying attention in a sustained and particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. The practice of mindfulness brings to our awareness immediacy and feeling, deeper perception, alternative perspectives, and awareness of personally and culturally held prejudices. The practice of mindfulness is a different way of knowing and understanding. And when the practice of mindful awareness is coupled with meditation, our consciousness opens to a more inclusive and integral way of living. Mindful awareness and meditation provide the vehicle for us to incorporate a shift in our personal and collective consciousness and our collective culture. One of the biggest detriments to peace, inclusive behavior, and loving the other is living in a culture that is reinforced by divisive thoughts and fear-based habits of mind. We are in need of practicing being aware of the cultural manifestations, read our behaviors, that are exclusionary, conformist, self-protective, and religiously exclusive. We must become aware how our everyday actions and thoughts may be bound up in identifying with the contents of our thoughts and emotions, and with the narratives we build around ourselves based on how much we like or dislike what is happening to us. By becoming aware of these habits of mind and resultant behaviors, and then by consciously releasing those images and perspectives, we are then emptying the images and resulting motivations that are residing, as it were, in our consciousness. Becoming aware of and releasing these patterns allows us to more fully recognize and engage in the emergent future as new cultural expressions begin to arise. We are, in fact, reconfiguring our idea of who we are, a who we are that can now be inclusive of the other. For those whose consciousness is tied to and who object to releasing fundamentalist and dogmatic religious perspectives, it is well to note that because I understand and accept the presence of a different form of religious belief, doesn't mean that I have to embrace or follow it. One element for reconfiguring our thought patterns and behaviors and consciousness is accomplished through educating ourselves about those who are arriving on our shores, by engaging these people in their expressions of the who they are, by entering into dialogue, by engaging in play, sports, and art, prayer and eating together. These types of activities are ways to get outside of our individual and cultural ego. The ego that insists that we are right and that others must fit in. Throughout our history, the idea of fitting in never quite worked. Think of the prejudice and turmoil wrought by our reaction to the Great Irish Migration, the Italian migration, the insistence of forcing Native Americans to accept Christianity. It was only after we began to see the other as person, as a reflection of the who I am, that we can begin to see our unity in being. That is, as being humans who have the same motivations to love and live peacefully. It is then that we are able to begin to engage the emergent future. When we place within our consciousness an image of a future that is inclusive, that celebrates and embraces differences, the other, when that image is the lens through which we see the world, this is when the emergent future of becoming a united people will become a reality, and a more enlightened culture will emerge. Becoming aware of the separateness we hold in our mind's eye, becoming aware of the fears we may have that we will lose our identity or lose our way of life, our livelihood, if we are inclusive and if we let go of the individualistic habits of mind, is a mindful step toward embracing our deeper inner self. Paying attention to our inner self and our everyday actions in a different and mindful way will place us on the path of creating a future beyond tolerance, to a future grounded in mutually acceptable congeniality and love. A love that sees through divisiveness and is able to hold paradox, namely, the paradox of the other as me. Even though that other looks differently, speaks a different language, and eats a different food, holding the paradox of unity and diversity happens when we see with a different eye, when we see mindfully. And through seeing with a different eye and through a different frame, a global mindset begins to surface within self and culture. A global view exhibiting Keegan's fifth order of consciousness that is beyond egocentricity, that is me, beyond ethnocentric, which is us, but is rather fifth order, a world-centric, all of us, view of living. If one grows from egocentric to ethnocentric, one doesn't stop caring about oneself, but one's care and concern is expansive and inclusive and now extends to one's family, community, nation, and so on. Quote, likewise, with the growth from ethnocentric to world-centric, that care is now extended to all people, regardless of race, class, creed, gender, etc., unquote. So says Wilber. And what about the liberal project? What about modernity? Since the Enlightenment, our consciousness has been framed by quantitative questions concerned with proving, through the rational model, the truths of science and the world in general. This has manifested itself in secularism that has all but dismissed metaphysics and faith. As Wilber stated, the Western intellectual tradition, beginning around the Enlightenment, actively repressed any higher levels of its own spiritual intelligence. With the rise of modernity, the mythic God was thoroughly abandoned, a mythic conception for which rational modernity could find little objective positivistic evidence. Furthermore, by ditching God altogether, we began the repression of the sublime, the repression of our own higher levels of spiritual intelligence, read consciousness. The intellectual West has fundamentally never recovered from this cultural and spiritual disaster. Our misreading of Locke and Hume has led us to the modernist dismissal of faith, the rise of division in thinking, and the emergence of personal, individualistic, internal faith. The individualistic form of faith proffered by Luther helped put a nail in the coffin of sacredness and spiritual intelligence as an integral part of our everyday life. But in recent times, there has been a reemergence or unfettering of religious belief. This is indicative of a central human need and drive to connect with what I call the mystery beyond, the transcendent and eminent reality that since pre-modern times has been recognized as informing and inspiriting our humanity. A force that through our asking questions takes us beyond the who we are. A force that through being drawn out exposes us to ways of knowing that transcend the limited and limiting rational positivistic model on which modernity solely acknowledges as valid. What does all this have to do with consciousness, inclusion, and a multicultural approach to life and work? As the founder and president of SDGKU and ITC, Miguel Cardenas Sr. stated, "The realities of growing migratory flows due to poverty, wars, and instability are the reasons for growing a multicultural society and workplace in both advanced as well as emerging economies." For us to resolve these challenges, we must move from our conventional approach of how we make change to an approach based on releasing us from our limited and limiting habits of mind. On societal level, our business, governmental, and religious institutions must begin to incorporate practices that open us up to the other, that is, to embracing difference. Incorporating mindfulness practices will change the limited consciousness that is reinforced through our bureaucratic and industrial positivistic habits of mind. In his 2019 SDGKU paper on effecting change through creativity and curiosity. Briscoe suggested that businesses should, among other things, quote, address the human side, unquote, of the change process. I see his call for behavioral change as essential and effective if, writ large, grounded in mindfulness practices that release us from the strictures that prevent change, namely, practices that release us from our industrialized and divisive habits of mind. Otherwise, the call for behavioral changes in our institutions and organizations result in anecdotal salves. They will not affect the real changes that are necessary to unleash creativity and curiosity, acceptance of the other cultures, and acceptance and inclusion of the other within our milieu. Mindfulness practices must be underlying principles that these behavioral antidotes emerge through. Because practicing a mindful approach to life frees us to, in a non-sectarian manner, touch that which is beyond our life and thought patterns. The mystery beyond experiencing the transcendent and immanent reality through losing our egocentric consciousness. The practice of mindfulness, along with some forms of meditation, will assist us in shifting our defensive habits of mind, our patterns of thought that are exclusive, delimiting, and egocentric. And in shifting of our pattern of thought and behaviors from an egocentric frame to an inclusivity, we are learning how to go beyond tolerating, to embracing, accepting, and including the other. As I stated above, I believe we are really dealing with a question of consciousness, of awareness of the workings and movements of our innermost self, awareness of our perceptions, awareness of our perspective, how we see and act in the world, and our capacity to recognize our prejudices, our limitations, and whether or not those habits of mind dictate our thoughts and, most of all, our behaviors. How do I react to the other that does not fit into my perceptions of what I think is right? Can I respond rather than react? Do we react or respond to the discomfort that emerges in us due to the shift in the demographics of my culture? How can I respond to a different way of being? As with Middle Eastern cultures, we too react out of fear of loss, fear that our identities are being suppressed. However, contrary to being forcibly suppressed and having another culture imposed on us, our change process is slower and less violent, at least for the most part. This peaceful emergence, both like the emergence of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution in the West, into what we are becoming, may sometimes be shaken due to the actions of those who may be characterized as extreme, radical, and easily influenced. But do the actions of the very, very few determine my consciousness and my actions? Can I take responsibility to work on myself, expand my knowledge, expand my consciousness, and draw a larger circle of inclusion rather than a box of exclusion? Can I challenge my friends, colleagues, school system, government, my church, my synagogue, temple, mosque, my priest, my bishop, minister, rabbi, imam, to respond to the changes rather than retreat and react? Can I bring them to question and challenge their inner self, their habits of mind, to challenge their conventional interpretations of Scripture, dogma, and structure? Can I bring people together in dialogue, or will I simply let someone else take responsibility? These patterns of thought and their emergence in multiple, highly variable cultures across modern international boundaries may in part be presently due to the unprecedented, ever-increasing interacting and integrating of people, economies, and nation-states, which pose both great challenges and opportunities for leaders to demonstrate exemplary social stewardship in recognizing diversity of thought not as a weakness, but as a strength. Occurring across the globe at a pace never witnessed before, the equality of women has been fortified and institutionalized as a vital component of designing a sustainable future. For instance, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals lists gender equality as goal number 5. Gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. Providing women and girls with equal access to education, health care, decent work, and representation in political and economic decision-making will fuel sustainable economies and benefit societies and humanity at large. In our increasingly multicultural workplace, women will have an increasingly strategic and important role given the need to conciliate opinions and find common ground with a more human perspective and touch that their gender promotes. Equal pay for equal responsibility between genders is not only equitable in organizations, but also productive and smart. In closing, I'd like to say that although technology has made our world much smaller, connecting us in ways never imagined before, our cultural diversity and contrasting religious values around the world have been separating us in recent years. With many of the leaders representing our communities, regions, and countries now promoting border walls, segregation, and ethnic separation instead of tolerance, negotiation, solidarity, and civility, which should be the benefits of mindful leadership and multicultural environments. Let us unite, not separate, for a better and more peaceful world. Thank you.